Alright, hi everyone. I'm back today with another video. Now, if you can remember, about 2 years ago, I did a video called Is Pro Wrestling Dead? And in the video, I argued whether or not pro wrestling was dying. I think I said that although it won't die anytime soon, it was definitely on a decline. And since I did that video, I think pro wrestling has definitely seen a little bit of a resurgence. It has seen a bit of a resurgence in popularity because just recently I was over by what was once the Rosemont Horizon but is now the Allstate Arena, and I was there around the time of a taping of Raw, Monday Night Raw. Now, for those who don't know, Monday Night Raw is the name of the WWE's Monday Night Pro Wrestling show. And I saw the parking lot, and it was pretty packed. There were a lot of people there. So, yeah, I don't know. A lot of podcasters at the time were saying that it's dead and it's dying. But I don't know. It seems like it has received a bit of a resurgence in popularity. Because, even though podcasters will talk about it dying, well, it's just kind of changed a lot. It's certainly a lot more theatrical and a lot more sports entertainment related, as the pro wrestling itself is, kind of less. It's not as much of that as there used to be. And it's probably like older guys, who kind of long for the glory days of pro wrestling and what it was, and that are saying that it's dying. Because it does seem like, it still does have some popularity. It certainly is not what it was in the 80s and 90s. I mean, it's definitely declined a lot since then, but it seems like it has spiked in popularity as of late. Definitely, I have noticed that. But what I want to do this video on today is I want to talk about pro wrestling and the 10 most influential, actually 12 most influential pro wrestlers of all time. Without these 12 guys, pro wrestling just would not be the way it is today. May not have ever really become that big ever if it weren't for these 12 guys. These 12 pro wrestlers certainly have shaped pro wrestling and have caused pro wrestling to explode in popularity in the 80s and 90s. Now, the first pro wrestler that I want to mention as being really iconic is probably the most iconic pro wrestler of all time. And that, of course, would be Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan really is the first pro wrestler to become a household name. A lot of this had to do with the exposure that he had gotten in the film Rocky III that really led to him becoming, the one pro wrestler people really knew at the time, and that caused him to become a superstar. He had that match with the Iron Sheik, which I want to say was around 83, 84, and after that match, Hulkamania began. And you could pretty much argue that Hulkamania has never really died. It's still, Hulk Hogan is still pretty popular. Yeah, he's had some problems. He had that whole issue with Gawker and all that, and he sued him, and he got a lot of money for it. Recently, he has appeared in some WWE events, and, the fans seem to still explode when he enters the arena. So I think, Hulk Hogan definitely could be considered the most, iconic pro wrestler of all time. He's, if you weren't a serious pro wrestling fan in the 70s and 80s, probably the only pro wrestler you were aware of would have been Hulk Hogan. And if you were serious, maybe you knew who Superstar Billy Graham was, maybe you knew who Bruno Sammartino was, Bob Backlund. But if you were a serious, if you were not a serious fan, you at least knew the name Hulk Hogan. So that's why I have to mention Hulk Hogan as really being the most iconic pro wrestler of all time. After Hulk Hogan, and again, this list is in no particular order, after Hulk Hogan, the next pro wrestler that I have to mention is not as iconic as Hulk Hogan. He certainly didn't become a household name, but if you have followed pro wrestling for any length of time, you definitely know who this guy is. And that, of course, would be Ric Flair. Woo! I had to do that. You know, talking about Ric Flair, I just felt I had to do that. But, yeah, Ric Flair's probably the best promo guy of all time in pro wrestling. Definitely had really entertaining promos. I mean, just go on YouTube and YouTube some Ric Flair promos, and, you know, you'll find them pretty entertaining. So I would definitely have to go with Ric Flair. As far as the wrestling itself and his ability in the ring, he always kind of had the same match with anyone he wrestled, right? I mean, it was good, but it was always pretty much the same match. You always knew what you were going to see when he was in the ring, right? He'd walk to the ring, go, woo! Then he'd, you know, chop his opponent in the chest a few times, go, woo! Again. Then his opponent would grab a hold of him, knock him to the ground. Ric Flair would get up, but then he would do the Ric Flair flop. Then Ric Flair would get up again, take his opponent to the ground, put him in the figure 4. His opponent would reverse it. You know, it was pretty much more or less that kind of thing in every match. You know, it was always kind of the same match that he had with people. But definitely a very iconic wrestler, at least among pro wrestling fans. Like I said, certainly wasn't a household name if you didn't follow pro wrestling. If you never did, you might not even know who Ric Flair even is. But among pro wrestling fans, Ric Flair is one of the most well-known names. So definitely have to include Ric Flair on this list. Number 3 would have to be Macho Man Randy Savage. I mentioned in the last video that I saw Macho Man Randy Savage at the Rosemont Horizon back in 1988 in a match with Andre the Giant. And I remember it was packed at that time. And at this point in time, Macho Man Randy Savage had become a superstar. He is a second-generation pro wrestler. His dad, Angelo Poffo, was a pro wrestler. His brother, Lanny Poffo, was also a pro wrestler. But none of them have achieved the fame that Macho Man Randy Savage did. You probably know him for the commercials he did, but he was also a very famous pro wrestler as well. Had what many people consider to be one of the best matches of all time, and that was his match with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. So I definitely have to mention that. I also have to mention that Ric Flair actually had probably one of the best feuds of all time with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat back in '78. So I had to definitely got to mention that. But Macho Man Randy Savage, definitely a well-known pro wrestler. Maybe even well-known among people who haven't followed pro wrestling. Not as much as Hulk Hogan, but I think he was pretty famous. Now, after Macho Man Randy Savage, the next pro wrestler that I have to mention is a man called Sting. Definitely have to mention Sting. Sting, it's pretty interesting with Sting. Sting's actually from Southern California. There's not really a whole lot of pro wrestlers that have come out of Southern California. I mean, in the United States, most pro wrestlers come out of either Minnesota or Florida. That's where most pro wrestlers are from. You know, Southern California, really not too many. I can't even think of too many that have come out of there. Rick Drayson, I believe he's from that area or somewhere around there, but, you know, other than him and Sting, I can't think of too many. But Sting, it's kind of interesting with Sting, too. Sting was a bodybuilder who was working at a Gold's Gym and someone came in and they wanted to put a stable together called Power Team USA, which also had Jim Hellwig, the Ultimate Warrior, in it. And this guy wanted to put it together, and Sting happened to be there and happened to be the guy they were looking for, and he joined it. You know, Sting was not a pro wrestling fan. Hulk Hogan was the only pro wrestler he had ever heard of. So he joined this, and then later he tag teamed with the Ultimate Warrior in a team called the Blade Runners. And then he joined what at that time was the NWA, had a feud with Ric Flair, and then pretty much became a star and later became the franchise of WCW. But, yeah, Sting, and I do believe that if Sting was in the WWE, or, WWF as it was known at the time, if he was in it in the mid-'80s, I don't think Hulkamania would have ever happened, because Sting definitely had that look that they were looking for in the 80s. He had the bodybuilder physique with the blonde flat top, and he had this kind of like all-American boy kind of image. And that was kind of what Vince McMahon wanted to promote back in the 1980s. And I don't see how Hulk Hogan would have been able to top that at that time. I mean, at that particular time, Hulk Hogan didn't really have as much of that all-American boy image that Sting had. So I really think Sting would have been the iconic pro wrestler in the 1980s, and not Hulk Hogan if Sting was in WWE at the time. Sting was the one wrestler that was in NWA, WCW, but he had never gone over to WWE until the very, very end of his career, which just recently ended not too long ago, and he wasn't in there for too long. But, yeah, Sting's definitely pro wrestler I had to mention. The next pro wrestler that I want to mention is Shawn Michaels. And I have a Shawn Michaels story. I'll mention it in just a moment. But Shawn Michaels was a very charismatic pro wrestler, very entertaining guy, good on the mic like Ric Flair. Also very good in the ring. He was a smaller wrestler. He wasn't as big as a lot of the other pro wrestlers, but, he was more athletic. He could really move in the ring. And, that was kind of part of his image, I think, was that he would win matches not on brute strength, but on skill and athleticism. So, definitely have to include him because he was a part of D-Generation X, which also had Triple H in it. Now, I've never been a Triple H fan. I kind of thought his Conan gimmick was cool, but that's where I would end it. I always felt that he just didn't seem like a superstar. He'd, be the guy who'd be in a match with the superstar, but not really a star himself. And he did some things to advance in the company, and that's why he became as famous as he did, but I just don't think he had the talent ever. I really don't. Shawn Michaels, on the other hand, was the driving force in DX. Shawn Michaels started out as a tag team wrestler with Marty Jannetty. When they went to WWE, which was in the early 90s, they had a falling out around 93. Shawn Michaels became a singles wrestler, and that's when he became the superstar that he became. And my Shawn Michaels story is I was walking down a beach on Anna Marie Island, which is near Sarasota, Florida. Kind of a quiet beach. I walked down this pier, and as I'm walking off the pier, I walk past this guy. I look at him, and I see he has a heart tattoo. And the first thing I thought was, oh, that guy has a heart tattoo just like Shawn Michaels. Then I walk off the pier and I think, oh, wait a minute. And then I stop dead in my tracks. I turn around and I look, and I see a small group of kids flocking around this guy. I then realized that was Shawn Michaels that just walked past me. So I walked back out onto the pier, and I got to meet Shawn Michaels, and he was a pretty cool guy. So kind of a cool experience. Definitely a very surreal one. But after Shawn Michaels, I would have to go with Bret the Hitman Hart. Definitely Bret Hart. Bret Hart is a second-generation wrestler. His dad, Stu Hart, owned Stampede Pro Wrestling, which is a wrestling promotion based in Calgary, Canada. And in the 80s, Stu Hart sold Stampede Pro Wrestling to Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon bought it, but he bought it under the condition that he would make Bret Hart and Owen Hart, which were Stu Hart's sons, that he would make them both star wrestlers, which is what he did. Bret Hart definitely had an it factor about him as a pro wrestler. Bret Hart is probably most pro wrestlers' favorite pro wrestler. I mean, there's a lot of pro wrestlers, you hear them in interviews and stuff when they talk about pro wrestlers, they'll usually mention Bret Hart as being their favorite pro wrestler. It's usually the name they kind of throw out there. Bret Hart, was their favorite pro wrestler. It's why they wanted to be a pro wrestler. Like I said, Bret Hart definitely had an it factor. He was not the best promo guy, but he definitely was really good at working a match. It was always a different match with Bret Hart. And people have said that Bret Hart could make it look like he was just beating the hell out of you, and you would barely feel it. And when you're a pro wrestler, that's what it's all about. You really got to make it look like you're hurting the guy without actually hurting the guy. And Bret Hart was, a pro at doing that. Kind of the opposite of Ric Flair. Like I said, Ric Flair, really good promos, not as good with variety in terms of a match. Bret Hart, not as good with the promo, but could always work a real good match. And Bret Hart also, like I said, had that it quality, that it factor to him. I mean, you really couldn't put your finger on what it was exactly. It was kind of like an X factor. You couldn't tell what it was. Definitely had kind of a cool persona about him. But it's kind of why Ric Flair and Bret Hart are my two favorite pro wrestlers of all time. One guy's better at one thing than another guy is, but those would definitely be my two most favorite pro wrestlers, I would have to say. But moving right along, after Bret Hart, I would have to go with The Undertaker, because The Undertaker is the most famous gimmick pro wrestler of all time. Gimmick pro wrestlers tend not to be really all that popular, right? They usually aren't. Guys like, the Mountie, or if a guy has a Native American gimmick, or maybe a guy will have a cowboy gimmick. That's always been popular. Biker gimmicks have been big. Clown gimmicks. There have been all kinds of gimmicks in the history of pro wrestling. I believe The Undertaker's the most popular gimmick character of all time. I mean, his real name's Mark Calloway, and yet he's always been The Undertaker. He's never wrestled under the name Mark Calloway that I'm aware of. He's always just been The Undertaker, and he's kind of tweaked and changed that gimmick around. Started out kind of like a cowboy zombie kind of gimmick. Then he became then I believe he had this sort of like gothic kind of gimmick. Then there was the Lord of Darkness gimmick. Then he had a biker gimmick. Dead Man Inc., I think he called it. And now I think he's just The Undertaker again. And for a while also, there was a whole thing where he was undefeated at WrestleMania, and it was kind of a whole thing of, who will beat the Undertaker at WrestleMania. And eventually it was Brock Lesnar. But, so have to include The Undertaker. After The Undertaker, I would definitely have to say Andre the Giant. Probably the most famous big man of all time. 7'5", 505 pounds was his build, height, and weight. Now, I do think they kind of exaggerate those heights and weights, but that was his, build, height, and weight. And, Andre the Giant, definitely a wrestler people wanted to see. He had a memorable match with Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 3, but he had a lot of other memorable matches throughout his career. Also did some movies. In fact, the first thing I saw him in was the TV show Greatest American Hero. And I remember seeing it when I was a little kid, and I was like, man, I had no idea a human being could get that big. I know it was TV, but that was the largest human being I had ever seen. So, yeah, have to include Andre the Giant. After Andre the Giant, I'm going to have to go with Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, I wasn't a huge Stone Cold Steve Austin fan, but I do think Stone Cold Steve Austin was a great actor. And I also think he had a great feud with Vince McMahon. And you do have to admit he was kind of the driving force behind the whole Attitude Era of WWE. You do have to admit that. Yeah, that's why I got to include Stone Cold Steve Austin in all this. His feud with Vince McMahon was really pretty good. It started out as kind of like a feud between an employee and a boss, but it went deeper than that, because Vince McMahon always wanted to be not just a promoter, he wanted to be a pro wrestler, and you could tell. I mean, he worked out and trained like a pro wrestler. He wanted to be a pro wrestler, but his dad told him, you can't be a promoter and a pro wrestler at the same time. You gotta pick one or the other. And I think that was really what made that feud classic, between Vince McMahon and Steve Austin. And it's definitely the kind of thing you wanted to tune in for each week. That's for sure. So, yeah, after Stone Cold Steve Austin, I would have to go with The Rock. The Rock, probably you could say The Rock is the number one action guy in the movies right now. There have been movies where the movie didn't do so well, but then they put The Rock in the sequel, and it ended up doing great. So that's why he has a successful film career right now, because people want to see movies that The Rock is in. And he is a good actor. He definitely is a good actor. Action stars tend not to be real good actors. They're really not. But The Rock, I think, is a pretty good actor. And in pro wrestling, started out, he was the guy everyone booed. Later on, he became kind of like a heel, but he was kind of like a cool heel. Or he was like something in the middle of babyface and heel. I think they call that a tweener, where he's kind of like in the middle. Not quite the guy everyone cheered, not quite the guy everyone booed, but something in the middle of that. And you could kind of say Steve Austin was kind of like that too. He wasn't the, Hulk Hogan of the 80s, who was a total babyface. For those who don't know, the babyface is the guy everyone cheers. The heel is the guy everyone boos. And there's something, what I'm saying is that there's something in between that. And I think, like I said, I heard that referred to as a tweener, where, it's kind of like a shade of gray in a way. So, okay, after The Rock, I have to go with Dusty Rhodes. Dusty Rhodes, although, never really that great in the ring, never really had the look of a pro wrestler, never really, had the kind of physique you would associate with a pro wrestler. He was a very charismatic guy. My understanding is when he was wrestling, he was also a booker as well. So, he had a couple of jobs at the same time. So, yeah, he really he had good mic skills. You know, he could really do a good promo. And that's really why I would put him on this list. And most people would agree with that. You know, Dusty Rhodes, one of the most charismatic pro wrestlers of all time. I certainly do agree. After Dusty Rhodes, I'm going to have to go with superstar Billy Graham. A superstar Billy Graham, a lot of people are probably unfamiliar with him, but still let you know, superstar Billy Graham was pretty popular in the 70s. And I include him on this list because he was the blueprint. You know, the blueprint of the modern sports entertainer pro wrestler that a lot of people have, you know, pretty much copied over the years. You know, Jesse Ventura, for example, definitely copied superstar Billy Graham's gimmick. In fact, Vern Gagne of the AWA told him to do it. You know, he said, we're losing the superstar. Can you copy his gimmick? And Jesse Ventura did. Hulk Hogan, in his early days, definitely took something from superstar Billy Graham. You know, and in addition to that, Scott Steiner would be another one. Austin Idol would be another. You know, it's the first guy, he was really the first, at least that I'm aware of, he was really the first steroid monster in pro wrestling. And he was a very huge guy. And he would come to the ring and talk about his pythons. And it would be more about kind of like a story rather than him in a wrestling match. Although he would wrestle. But it was more about, you know, him being an entertaining persona. And for that, you could say he was really the first sports entertainer. Vince McMahon was a big fan of the superstar. That was what Vince McMahon wanted to promote. However, Vince McMahon's dad owned the company at that time. Vince didn't have any say, and Vince McMahon's dad favored the smaller grappler kind of pro wrestler like Bob Backlund. So he made Bob Backlund a star and not superstar Billy Graham. But Vince McMahon has said that, you know, if he owned the company at the time, he would have put superstar Billy Graham in that Hulk Hogan slot, and he would have been the huge icon in pro wrestling. But so yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about that. And, you know, later, superstar Billy Graham, he had a lot of health problems because, like I mentioned, you know, he did do steroids, and he did quite a few. And now I guess he has a hard time, like, moving around and whatnot. You know, he is still alive, but, you know, he just has a difficult time getting around. I know he's talked and spoken out against the use of steroids. So, definitely have to include superstar Billy Graham on this list. You know, like I said, he was very iconic. First guy to really come to the ring, talk about his arms being pythons and all that. And you see a lot of pro wrestlers do that nowadays or years following him. And, you know, a lot of people are not aware of where that came from. So it really came from superstar Billy Graham. So, all right, well, that's my list. You know, those are the pro wrestlers that I feel if you took any of these guys out of pro wrestling, it would not have become what it became. It became what it became because of the 12 guys that I mentioned in the course of this video. You know, and if you watch this video, if you got all the way through it, I do thank you for watching. You know, I did do another video on pro wrestling, which a little bit different from this. Like I said, my last video dealt with, is pro wrestling dead? Is it dying? And right now, doesn't really show signs that, you know, it is something that is dying. And it's kind of strange because in this month, from what I've been told, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus is actually going to be going out of business. And I think it's been in business for like over 140 years. And now it's going out of business. So, you know, will that happen to pro wrestling? maybe one day, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. Because like I said, there has been a resurgence or a spike in popularity recently. Still not as big as it was, like I said, in the 80s and 90s, but, you know. Well, that's my video. If you watched it, as always, I do thank you for watching. Have a great day.